Okay, I'm Stephen J. Abramson. Today is June 23rd, 2004, and I'm conducting an interview with Stephen J. Cannell, and we are in Pasadena, California. Okay, we'll start right at the very beginning.
All right.
What was your name when you were born?
My name when I was born was Stephen Joseph Cannell. I was born in 1941 in Los Angeles Hospital.
Did you have any nicknames as a child?
You know what? I had some nicknames in college. Some of them probably you don't want to hear, but no, I didn't have a lot of nicknames. I was always just Steve,
What was the date of your birth?
February 5th, 1941.
Okay. And you were born in Los Angeles. Where did you grow up?
I grew up here in Pasadena. Actually, I think when I was first born, we lived over on the west side of town until the first grade. And when I was in the first grade, my mom and dad and my sister moved over to Pasadena, to a house that's really probably about 4 blocks from this one that we're sitting in. And and I went to school, over here, and I've stayed here ever since. I love this area.
Does that house still exist?
Yeah, the house still exists, and the school that I went to over here still exists, and I had kids that went to that same school. And yeah, this is my hood.
What was your father's name?
My father's name was Joseph Cannell. My father was probably the best guy I ever knew. My best friend, the guy I could say that if I wouldn't be the success that I became if it weren't for him. I've been using his ideas ever since I got into this business. His ideas about he wasn't a writer. He didn't he wasn't in show business, but his ideas about how to think and about how to behave and how to comport yourself, how to sell, and just watching him as a role model all through my early years and seeing the way he behaved toward the people that he employed. He was a self-made man. He came out of the Depression with nothing and became a multimillionaire out of his own head and his own work. And so watching him and the way he behaved was in my early life, really important. A lot of times I would listen to this stuff that he would say to me, and I'd think, what a bunch of poo, that isn't the way it really is. And then as I got older and I began to think back and realize that I used and started to employ all of his methodology, I realized how incredibly important he was to my life and is to my life, and was fortunate that he lived to be 87, so he got to see my success and actually serve on my board of directors at my company, and we just had a great time together, my dad and I.
What did he do for a living?
Well, my dad was my grandfather had come over here from England and was a newspaper salesman. Stood literally on a street corner in San Francisco selling newspapers, and he sold newspapers to get his family over here. And then one day he said, I could put some cigars and cigarettes on my little street side stand. And then he got some cigar boxes, and the next thing you know, he got some little tchotchkes that he got from Europe that he had friends of his from Europe sent over from London. And the next thing you know, he rented a little storefront, and he started to bring in some small antiques and still sold newspapers and magazines. And the next thing you know, he had a little antique store, and he moved to Nob Hill, and he had a beautiful house on Nob Hill, and he became sort of a middle-class merchant and was completely wiped out by the San Francisco fire. Came down to Los Angeles, the earthquake and fire, came down to Los Angeles, set up a company down here, basically reproduced his success again from the ground up. And during the Depression, my father, who was at UCLA, at USC, and my uncle, who had just graduated from college, had to go in and work. My dad had to drop out of USC, never got his degree, because during the Depression, my grandfather needed people to work in the store. And it was just at that time a little one-room furniture antique store. And my father and my uncle basically took that over, and it became Cannell and Chafin, which was they had a partner who was basically a buyer who went around in Europe and bought furniture, and his name was Chapin, and they started to build that company up, and it became one of the most well-known chains of furniture stores here in Southern California. We had probably 6 or 8 different stores. And then my father opened a commercial division, and they did all commercial interiors all over the world. We did the LA Museum, we did the LA Airport, we did, I mean, it was a really big operation. There were probably about 400 or 500 people working there. And my dad had started from basically working as a salesman in my grandfather's little one-room antiques shop, and then he went on and started to develop other businesses on his own. A wallpaper company called the Van Leeuwen Wallpaper Company, which ended up being the largest screen printer of wallpaper in the world. It was located in Burbank. My father ran into this guy named Albert Van Leeuwen, who was a really talented guy who designed this wallpaper, screen printing wallpaper, and he invested in this company, and it became a huge company, which he eventually sold to the Simmons Mattress Company for millions of dollars. So my dad was a very smart, entrepreneurial type guy in a creative industry, but certainly not a writer or in show business.
How about your mom? What was her name?
Carolyn Baker Cannell, and she went to UCLA, and that was in the days when if a woman had a husband who was making money, she didn't work. So my mother never really worked. She was sort of one of those people that that was on the board of every organization she always ended up the secretary treasurer for some reason or other. She was always the secretary treasurer of every group she was in. And, she was a really great, person, very much different than my father in terms of her interests. But they were married for 60 years and set a tremendous example for my wife and I, who are now into our 40th year of marriage. And, they provided a really stable environment for my sister and myself. And that was only the two of us as children. And she's 18 months older than I am. And it was just a, really great place to grow up. And, I always felt like, that my life was secure, that I was in a place where I was loved. My dad and mom provided really good environment for Lynn and I, and then, there were a lot of other things that we got the best of everything. I mean, my parents took us on trips. We went skiing every Christmas and every Easter, and it was just we were in an upper middle class situation. So I didn't grow up with a wolf at the door. And my father was so aggressive about trying to teach me what life was about and what values were, that it would have been very easy for me to grow up as sort of a country club golfer, who had some kind of cheeseball job and spent most of my time, up at the bar at the golf club. He was really determined that I wasn't going to end up like that I was going to have some ambition, that I was going to have a sense of, of what it took to succeed in life. And during the summer when I would be sleeping late, my dad would come in and literally kick underneath my bed. "Hey, what are you doing?" I'm sleeping, Dad. I was out till 2 o'clock. "Get up! No son of mine sleeps till noon," That was the way it was. He'd be laughing at me, but you know what? He was serious. I had to get out of bed. And, and then when I was 13 years old, he said to me, "Okay, you're going to work." And I went, "Dad, it's summer, all my friends are going to the club and the tennis club and the golf club and down at the beach." I said, "It's summer." Well, I said, No, you're going to work." So I had to go get a work permit, because at 13 you had to have a work permit in order to work. And I went to work at his wallpaper company. And I went down there, and it was this huge, it was about 4 acres under a roof in Burbank, and I was down there working on a screen printing machine, and and I used to come home thinking, what am I doing this for? All my friends were playing tennis and golf, and but he just said, not you, buddy. This is what people do to feed their families. You're going to see what this is all about. And I was really angry about that, but you know what? He instilled in me a work ethic, and I'll tell you that today I can outwork almost anybody, and one of the reasons that I've been so successful is because of that work ethic.
Your sister's name is Lynn,
Mhm.
right? What's her full name?
Well, her full name is Carolyn. My mother's name was Carolyn, and
Okay.
so we couldn't have two Carolyns in the
Okay.
family. So we had my mother Carolyn and my sister Lynn.
Okay. Tell me about your early influences. I mean, did you listen to radio? Were there books that you read, movies that you saw as a you know a young
Well,
boy?
in my early life, to begin with, I have to tell you, and it's an important part of my story, I have severe learning problems. Severe learning problems. The first grade I flunked was the first grade. Now, what we were doing in the first grade, I have no idea that I couldn't handle. I mean, I remember we were sitting in sandboxes and we were stacking blocks and stuff, but I apparently didn't make the cut because they told my parents that I had to repeat that grade, which I did. And, you know, when you repeat the first grade, people can say, well, it's probably because he's a little, you know, hyperactive or something like that. You know, maybe he just wasn't concentrating as much. But then I also had to repeat the fourth grade. Now, the fourth grade I had to repeat, and everybody knew I had to repeat that grade because I couldn't read anything. We had a little Dick and Jane reader, and I could not read. I would look at those pages and I would see a word here, the, and, it, but I couldn't read see Scott run, or Spot run. I couldn't put those sentences together. And I remember sitting in that class, still I can remember, dreading if the teacher was going to call on me to stand up and read a page of that book, because my classmates could all do it and I couldn't. So I flunked the fourth grade. I went to a remedial school in the fourth grade, which was supposed to teach me how to read, and I'd been at a private school, which was 4 or 5 blocks from this house. And I went to this remedial school and spent like a year having pencils come at my nose because they were saying, well, it's a perceptual problem. It's his eyes that's causing this trouble. And he needs to learn how to focus on an object, which was a total waste of time. But they did teach me in that school to read. I rejoined that fourth grade class. Then I flunked the 10th grade. I was put back again with the younger kids. Pretty tough, you know, because you can't tell, you don't know why it's happening, you know. I mean, I would think I was studying really hard. So when you say, did I read? Absolutely not, you know. I mean, reading was tough for me. It was a chore. You know, I was not a man of letters. I was an athlete. Actually, in high school, I was a really good running back in high school. Was an all-CIF halfback, and and that was the only thing I was any good at. The only thing that I excelled at was football, and I was really good at that. I mean, and it was one of those kind of things where, you sort of think, thank God I had something, because that made me a big deal on my campus. I was recruited by colleges. And the idea to think that that I had one thing that I could do that people looked up to me for, because my academic, pursuits was just a mess. I graduated from my high school with a 2.1 cumulative GPA for the senior year, and I was told by the headmaster of the school that, because I was going to the University of Oregon, and he said, you won't last at the University of Oregon one semester, you'll be out by Christmas. That's what he told me, the headmaster of the school. So, I had real trouble academically. Certainly I loved movies and all of that, but basically I was a guy that loved to play sports. I was always out in the backyard with a football or a baseball, and I had, as bad as I was at school, I don't recall one day when I felt like I wasn't liked by my classmates. I watched my children grow up and watch that sort of ebb and flow of popularity, and all of a sudden your daughter comes home crying because she got the silent treatment today from all her friends and nobody would talk. I never felt a day where I didn't think I had friends everywhere. I was always a real popular kid. And I didn't work at it or anything like that, but I just got along, with people. I was real good with people, and it was a talent of mine, and it's basically because I like people, and so I always came at everybody with my hand out, and as a result of it was, I was always in the in crowd, but I also had friends all through the school that weren't in the in crowd, and I always just felt really accepted by my classmates.
What was the name of your high school?
I went to a bunch. I kept getting thrown out. I went to a school called Polytechnic, then I went to a school called Seymour, then I went back east. My dad always wanted me to be a highly educated guy, I think, because he had been forced to drop out of USC as a sophomore to go work in the furniture store. My dad wanted me to have a good education, and he used to say to me over and over again, there's only one thing, because he'd come through the Depression and had seen that people with money could just end up being completely squashed by a financial depression. And he said, there's one thing they can never take from you, son, one thing that no matter what happens, they can't take from you, and that's what's inside your head. And he said, you've got to put things in your head, because those have value, and they will allow you to go forward and succeed no matter what happens, with the economy of this nation or the politics of this nation.
At what point, okay, well, I was going to say, at what point did they actually get the diagnosis right? I mean, so you
Never.
actually, so, I mean, was there some point they said you had dyslexia? Or?
Oh yeah, when I was 35. Well, I was already had Emmys on my shelf. I mean, I didn't care then.
I was going to say, did it matter then, or?
No, it didn't matter to me. Oh, you know what it was? I had a daughter who had, this is a hereditary condition. And my oldest daughter was having the same problem in the 6th grade, and they were getting set to throw her out of a private school that she was in, and so we went. By then, I had started to read about dyslexia, and I knew that it was a reading condition, and that it had to do with mirror writing and mirror reading and sequencing and a lot of things like that. So I took her and had her tested at the Frostic Institute here in Los Angeles, and at the same time I got tested, because I knew that all the things that were troubling her were the same things that had bedeviled me through my high school years and elementary school years, and I turned out to be even more dyslexic than she, but she also has a good healthy dose of it. The only thing about that test that really bugged me, it really made me angry, I carried it around for a long time, was her IQ was higher than mine. I had to live with that for the rest of the time. I actually still do.
When you were a kid, what do you remember of was maybe the first TV show you watched, or some of the first television that you were exposed to?
Oh, I remember, a lot of the first thing that I remember when we first got our television, it was Hopalong Cassidy, little two-reeler black and white westerns, and I couldn't believe that these pictures were coming into our house. I remember my friend down the street had the first TV, and when we walked in there and looked at that, first we looked at the test pattern. Well, look at that! Can you believe that? That's being broadcast from. And then we would see Hopalong Cassidy and Bob Steele and Tom Mix and then the different kinds of half hours. I remember Flash Gordon and some of those early TV series that came on in the 50s.
Do you have any favorites?
Well, I think my favorite show as a young kid, or maybe probably I was in high school at this point, or maybe junior high school, was Maverick. I just thought that was about as cool a show as I'd ever seen. And then, of course, had the great joy of later in my life being able to work with Jim Garner on the Rockford Files. But I just loved that. I loved the character. I loved the humor of it. It was done by a guy named Roy Huggins, and Roy Huggins was basically my godfather in show business. I learned from Roy Huggins the same lessons that I learned from my dad, only they were show business lessons. I loved Roy like a father, and he had been the creator and producer of Maverick, and he was the guy I did Rockford with. So what a joy! I mean, to be able to connect up with people like Roy and Jim, but back then, I loved to watch television. I mean, television, was just coming of age, and then we had all those Warner Brothers shows back in that time, Sugarfoot, 77 Sunset Strip, another Roy Huggins show. Shows like Route 66 was a real favorite of mine when I was in college. Also got to work with Marty Miller when I was doing Adam 12. So one of the things to have these shows that were favorites and then end up actually being on shows with those same actors was really exciting.
What, was it Fugitive also, Roy Huggins?
Fugitive was Roy.
And The
Run for Your
Invaders?
Life was
Right.
Roy. I mean, I could give you Roy's credit list, you know.
When you mentioned you really excelled in athletics, when you were growing up and through high school, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do, though, as a career or in life?
Well, I thought I was going to go to work for my dad. I mean, I got to tell you, my dad he was a strong personality and a really great guy. But one of those kind of people that, you know, he reasoned with you. You know, he explained stuff to you. He was very upset that my grades were bad. You know, and these report cards would come home, and I would always be hopeful. I would always think, well, I'm going to get B's and C's, and it was always D's and F's. It was always a cut lower than I imagined that it might be. And I can remember when we'd go away on ski trips and the report card hadn't arrived before we left, and I would dread coming home because I knew it would be in the mail, and I knew it was going to be awful, and then I was going to have to sit down with the man I most cared about, my father, and try and deal with this with him. And he couldn't understand, you know, why I wasn't doing better, because obviously I'm verbal, I can communicate, you know. I certainly don't have a flat spot in my head, you know, that anybody could see or perceive. And so people would just say to me constantly, well, you know, you're not applying yourself. If you would apply yourself, you'd do better. And but I was trying as hard as I could, and I wasn't getting anywhere. You know, I mean, I would still get these lousy grades. So,
What did you go to one college, or did you?
Yeah,
you did.
I went to the University of Oregon, graduated in 4 years. I had I think my cumulative GPA on graduation was like a 2.2. That's like a C minus, you know. But hey, I don't know, what do I care? I can show you the diploma. It's hanging in my office. You know, I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college, which is what my dad wanted. And you know what? He was right. And I grew up a lot in college, became a man during my college years. I wanted to play football up there, but my grades were so bad that I couldn't play because I was redshirted. You know.
What drew you to writing?
Well,
I mean, here's a kid who could hardly read, you said, and
well, I can read. You know, I mean, I certainly graduated from private school. I mean, it was. I mean, I went to Choate in Wallingford, Connecticut, one of the best private schools in America. Now, I was the GOAT of my class. I had the lowest grade point average of any kid in the sophomore class at Choate. But I did get in, and I did go. I mean, I wasn't like I was illiterate, you know, but I was a very slow reader, and I have recall difficulties, which means that I can learn something, memorize it, and then have in a test, under a pressure situation, I can't recall it. And then the minute I walk out of that room, I can remember it again. You know, it's sort of like that feeling you get when your best friend comes to the table at a restaurant and you can't pull his name up. Well, it's that misfiling of information kind of thing, which is part of this condition. And you know, sequencing is another one. You know, when I act, I often have, and if I have a line that requires sequencing, you know, the character saying first you got to do this and that and this. If that's my line, you know, finding that sequence is very hard. I have to really make hooks from one idea to the other so that I can find my way through a sequence of events, because sequencing is very hard for dyslexics. I have that. So you know, those were all the things that were so hard for me, but it wasn't like I couldn't read. So why did I want to be a writer? Well, you know, I think it's in my DNA. I honestly think it's in my DNA. I always wanted to write. I'll tell you an interesting story. When I was in the 10th grade at a private school here in Pasadena, we were asked to write a poem on a current event. And I chose Martin Luther King's attempt to desegregate the schools in the South. And I wrote this thing in iambic pentameter, and it was like 6 stanzas or something. And I handed it in, and I got a B minus. Now, I got to tell you, a B minus was like, I didn't get B minuses. I was a D guy. I was a C guy at the very best. A B minus, I couldn't believe it. I saw that on I can still see it, a B minus, my God. So I took it home, you know, and I waited for my sister to come home, and I read it to her out loud, you know, and then she went to another school, and she was a couple of years ahead of me, and a private school. And then I read it to my dad, and then when he came home, and I read it to my mom. And at dinner, I stood up and read it at dinner, and then the next morning I read it at breakfast, and my mom and dad said, enough with the Martin Luther King poem, you know. My sister comes to me about a month and a half later. Now she's a senior, and I'm a sophomore, and she's at a private school here in Pasadena. And she says, I got to write a poem for my English class. I want your Martin Luther King poem. And I said, well, I only got a B minus. She was an A student. She said, I don't care. I don't write poems well, and I like that poem, so let me have it. Well, she was my older sister. I had to give it to her, right? So she turns it in. She gets an A. And they published it in her school literary magazine under her name. My first publication, I was a sophomore. So, there were indications, but what does it tell us, It tells us that perception drives result. And that my teacher, that was an A poem. I've subsequently reread it. I have it. It was an A poem, but my instructor knew that I was a lousy student, and he knew I wasn't going to be able to write an A poem, so he was cutting me a lot of slack by giving me a B minus. But my sister, who wasn't carrying any of that baggage, they could read that poem in her handwriting because she recopied it, and it was fine. It was an A. It was published in her school lit magazine. So I had indications that I could write. I almost got my wife thrown out of high school because of my writing ability. She once asked me to write a term paper for her. She'd done all the reading. She was an A student at a school called Westridge here in Pasadena, private school. She'd done all the research and everything. So I had all her note cards and everything, and I started to dictate to her this paper. And I was going for this kind of academic, erudite sound that you get in textbooks, And I have a good ear. I can reproduce anything I want to reproduce, So I knew what that stuff sounded like, and so that's how I dictated it to her, and she wrote it down word for word. I came home from football practice one day and stopped by her house, and she's crying. I go, what's wrong? She said, that poem, your paper, now it's all of a sudden my paper. I said, yeah. She said, well, they gave me an F, and they're going to throw me out of school, and they've accused me of plagiarizing it from a book. And I said, well, they can't do that, because if they're going to accuse you of plagiarism, they got to produce the material, and I dictated this, so they're never going to find it. So you just hold their feet to the fire and tell them. But I was so proud of myself, and that's what she did. I finally gave her a C minus, but I was so proud of myself because I had actually gone for that sound, and I had done it so well that there was no way that they were going to believe that I didn't get copied word for word out of a book. And I could always do that, So these were the little clues that I had along the way that. So then I go to the University of Oregon, and in my sophomore year, I run into a guy named Ralph Salisbury. I decided to take a creative writing course because I always wanted to be a writer. In my high school yearbook, under ambition, it says author, under my picture, and in my senior class yearbook. So I ran into this guy, Ralph Salisbury, my first creative writing teacher. And Ralph was this just amazing guy. He ran this incredible creative writing class. There were like 12 of us in there. And we would read our stories out loud, and he would never let the students in the class criticize negatively your work. At least the first 2 rounds of criticisms had to all be positive. And then you could start saying, well, I would think it would be a little better if you'd tried this or tried that. But basically, he started everything positive. So it was a lot of fun to get up and read your work because you got positive feedback. And one day I got a note on one of my stories.
Let's pick up with the second reel. We're going to stop tape right now and pick up with about that note as soon as we come back.